Welcome to Central Missouri Alumni Stories. I'm your host, Cory. Today's special guest is Tim Doke. Tim is a former UCM, CMSU alumni, a former UCM Alumni Foundation board member, and also the former vice president of corporate communications at American Airlines before, during, and after 9/11. So we are very excited to have Tim here on the show and look forward to getting right to it. Good. So how are you doing today, Tim?
I'm doing great, Cory. Thanks.
What is new in your world?
Well, as a retired person now, there's not much new. I am fortunate that my older daughter, who lives in London, is getting married in Edinburgh, Scotland next month, and so I'll be heading over there for the entire month of October. Edinburgh has become one of the family favorites. I went to grad school there.
Oh, you did? Okay.
At the University of Edinburgh, yeah. I thought I was going to be a lawyer, and after 1 year of law school,
Change plans.
If I see another law library, I'll scream.
That would be too many. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, so, good. Well, good for her, and good for you. That'd be a great trip.
It's become a family favorite place to visit, and we spend holidays there, and so it's going to be great. That I guess is what's new in my life.
Okay, fair enough. Well, good. I'm glad to hear that, Tim, because that sounds like a lot of fun. And for our audience, whether you are watching or listening, obviously I am based here in Kansas City, but Tim, you were in the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Correct. I moved to Dallas when I joined American Airlines. Actually, I was with I was with Hill and Knowlton, which is a large PR consulting agency, and actually started working on American Airlines in 1987, and commuted from Washington, D.C. to Dallas back and forth. Finally ended up getting an apartment here. And then in 1992, the then CEO of American, the legendary Bob Crandall, called me into his office one day and said, we need you to come aboard and run our corporate communications function. So, and it was a large function at that point. It included American Way magazine and about 8 other magazines that we published for other airlines and for, private clients, plus a television network that we ended up closing for cost.
No kidding.
And a staff of about 150 at the time. And, by the time I left in 2003, we were down to about 60 full-time staff. Yeah. So that sort of is the story of the airline business as I look through it,
Yep. And we're most certainly going to come back to that. I'm also interested, and I'm sure our audience is too, Tim, in hearing about the story of what led you there, right? What got you to Washington, D.C., what got you to Dallas with American. Then we'll talk some more about that, of course. But, just for the folks watching and listening at home, where does your story begin, Tim? Where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in Kansas City, and at age 2, my family moved to a little town of 500 people in the Texas Panhandle. My dad was a minister, and he didn't become a minister until after I was born. And I hope there was not a cause-effect relationship.
Sure.
But I grew up in small towns, mostly in the Texas and Oklahoma Panhandle. When you would take a different church on. And so I, went to high school up there. And as soon as I was finished, I was eager to see the Texas Panhandle in my rearview mirror. Actually, I was enrolled and already had, my class assignments and my roommate and everything at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. And the summer before I was to begin at LSU, I was in Kansas City visiting my grandparents, and my parents reminded me that we had close family friends who lived in Orangeburg, and Dr. Harley Hartung was a professor of kinesiology at the university, and I took my grandfather's car and drove down to see them and met him at his office. And he said, "I'm just getting ready to go into a 2-hour lab session. So why don't you just wander around campus and see if you can fill your time."
Okay.
And by the end of, I actually attached myself to one of those freshman orientation tours.
Smart.
The parents and the freshmen are like looking around and,
Taking it all in. Yep.
a jog at, being away from home. And when we got to the end of the tour, it was time to meet with the academic advisors. And I went up, when it was my turn and said, "Look, I'm not going to be enrolling here. I was just here to sort of see the campus, and it was a great tour." And they said, "Well, where are you going to college?" I said, "Well, LSU." And I just happened, that was back in the days of those weird dot matrix kind of printouts of computer schedules. So I had my class schedule in my wallet. So I pulled it out, and they said, "Well, we're on a trimester system. I don't know if you still are, or if the university still is. But we can sort of do all those same classes and condense it into, more exposure to the subject in a shorter amount of time."
Very
And
cool.
so I was really drawn by that. But mostly, growing up in the Texas Panhandle, I was drawn to the trees and the wonderful buildings on campus. I thought it was just a beautiful place. And when I showed back up at Dr. Hartung's office, I had an armload of books because back then the lending library in the library, gave you all the books you need, so you didn't have to go buy them.
Yep.
And that was one of the things I was actually dreading at LSU. So he was shocked, to say the least, when I showed up with books and an enrollment form. And he said, "Your parents are going to kill us." And drove to his house, and his wife said, "Your parents are going to kill us." And I called my parents from their house and told them what I'd done. And they said, "Well, if that's what you want to do, we're perfectly fine with it." Now, we lost some money at LSU, some deposit money. Sure. But I wouldn't change that whole experience for the world. I mean, it was just phenomenal. I had a phenomenal 4 years, a little 4 years plus, because after I went to law school for a year overseas, I came back and worked in the PR office where I'd worked as a student. I was on one of the student work study kind of programs to make money. And Carl Foster, who was the, again, legendary head of the CMSU at the time PR office, he tutored a lot of students along the way. Dean Vogelaar, who was the vice president of PR for the Royals for years, and the head of PR for Shell Oil Company, and a lot of people who had gone through his office had moved on to really nice careers. So when I decided I didn't want to stay in law school, Carl sent me a note and said, the head of the news bureau just left, and why don't you come back and run the news bureau until you figure out what you want to do? So I did, and I was taking some graduate classes while I was doing the news bureau. But in the middle of the spring of that year, that was sort of like late fall. So after about 4 months of being there, I got a call from a friend in Kit Bond's office. I'd worked summers for Kit, doing advanced work and traveling with him, and that was a great experience because my major, other than PR, was political science.
Okay.
And I joined the Missouri Division of Commerce at his request as the head of communications. I'm like 24 years old now, and I'm head of communications for the Missouri Division of Commerce. So it was pretty heady stuff. And again, like the summers when I was doing advanced work for KIT, I was traveling a lot with the governor. So and helping, with other Republicans. That was a different era of Republicans.
Sure.
They were very moderate and reasonable people. And but I got to know Jack Danforth really well and traveled with him. Spent a lot of time with John Ashcroft. In fact, babysat John Ashcroft's kids.
No kidding.
Yeah, when we were going to a rally of some sort, and their babysitter canceled on them, and Janet and John said, "We don't have a babysitter." And I said, "You know where the rally is. You don't need me along, so I'll take care of them." So Jay Ashcroft was just a toddler at the time, and I guess he's now in politics.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, everything you just said, there's a lot of questions that I want to ask you. For the sake of time, though, and just for clarity too, you ultimately, I love that you made that decision on a whim, the way that you did.
I do that.
It was in a day, right? It all happened in a day, effectively.
But in an afternoon.
In an afternoon, right after you were here visiting, and someone said, "Yeah, we've got a family friend." It's amazing how that works. But so when you graduated undergrad from CMSU or CMSC, I guess at the time.
Yeah.
Your undergrad degree was.
It had become the university by the time when I enrolled. It was CMSC.
Got it.
Okay. CMSU. Yeah.
So was your undergraduate degree? Did you say PR or political science?
Well, it was communications. I didn't. I had to actually petition the academic committee to create my own communications degree program, because I wanted to have a lot of business classes, business exposure, and that wasn't offered as a part of the traditional PR program. And there were just some courses that I thought would enhance the communications component of my career, and they didn't have a degree program that fit it. And fortunately, the committee approved my change of the major. So it's just literally a BA in communications and political science. So you can't find that degree on campus anymore.
Right. Okay.
You couldn't find it then. Yeah.
Very cool. So you graduated, went to law school overseas, came back, you worked in the UCM PR office for a couple of years?
No, only about 6 months or so. Yeah.
Okay.
It was sort of a holding spot pattern, and Carl Foster knew that I wasn't going to be there forever, because at a point in my career, once I decided that I wasn't going to go into law, I sent a letter from Edinburgh to Carl. That's back, way before emails and that sort of thing happened. And I sent a letter to Carl saying, "Well, I don't know what I do." And his response was, "You will be able to do whatever you want, but you need some time to just sort of unwind and figure out what it is you want to do." And so I went back to my safety zone, in the PR office, and it was only maybe 6 months later when I got a call from the governor's office. So
a quick side note, and I'll share this with you, Tim. I stumbled across your blog.
Oh,
I found a blog post from, I think it was from 2010, and it was about, and I loved reading it. It was Carl talking about writing to letters of the editor.
Yeah.
Writing letters to editors.
Yeah. Yeah. He could never let go. If he had a view, it was out in public, so he was a phenomenal influence. In fact, probably mean, when I got the Distinguished Alumni Award, I
Yeah.
cited Carl Foster as the greatest influence that I had on campus. So it was, it was. I should take up the blogging again, but I've got so many friends that are trying to get me to write a book that and it could be that that's the way to do it, is to blog it and then piece it together and make a book out of it. So,
okay.
Now the fascinating thing, Cory, about the time with the governor's office and working in the Division of Commerce is I had been on the job about 4 days, and my boss came to me and said, "We forgot to tell you when we were going through the hiring process." Meet Ramona in the background.
Sure, it's all right.
He said, "We forgot to tell you in the interview process that we've hired an agency in New York to help promote Missouri for industrial development and economic development and tourism and all of that." And I discovered that the agency was Carl Beyer and Associates, and I had actually studied Carl Beyer in my communications and political science classes, because he was one of the influential people to get the U.S. into World War I and then to build support for World War II, working for Franklin Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, respectively.
Okay.
So it was, it was sort of like, I'm going to work for the company that I studied. And so I was hired in New York, and basically, Kit lost his first bid for re-election, and then later came back and served 2 more terms before he went to the Senate. And they told me basically, when they find you, when the new administration finds you, you've got a home with us, because I obviously was a political appointee. So I called them the day that Joe Teasdale discovered who I really was. He'd enjoyed my speeches, and so he wanted me to find out more about me, and didn't particularly like my background. So
Sure.
So I find myself, a couple of weeks later, being met by a limo at LaGuardia and being rushed to it was the Barclay then, and now it's the Intercontinental, and spending a week or so with our account team right on Madison Avenue at Carl Beyer. And that was pretty heady stuff, to learn from the masters, really, because.
And you were how old at this time, Tim?
I was maybe 25.
Okay. Yeah.
And,
Wow.
It was pretty mind-boggling. And actually, I just did the math. I was 25. And so I said, where are you going to assign me? Because I was just doing sort of writing projects and things like that. And they said, well, as it turns out, the person who's been running our Kansas City prime time program, and I don't know if you have any recollection of that, but Hallmark was a huge Carl Beyer client for 40 some years at the time. And Hallmark and the Chamber of Commerce combined to promote the city of Kansas City, and it was called Prime Time. And obviously Hallmark's interest was they had just built Crown Center, and they wanted to see as much development happening in the city as possible. So they said, would you be willing to go back to Kansas City and be sort of our on-site representative? So I would spend 3 weeks a month in Kansas City, sort of like a beat reporter, chasing, digging up the stories that would make good national news and international news. And then I'd spend a week in New York, having them, take all that apart and learning more. I mean, it was just a constant learning process.
What an amazing experience! It's such a young age.
Well, and the fascinating part was it was divided into an economic development component and a public relations component. And the chairs of the public relations component that I would meet with every 2 weeks were Henry Block and Don Hall. And talk about heady stuff. I mean,
Yep.
when you're sitting across the table or, lunch or, however we decided to meet from the head of H&R Block and the head of Hallmark Cards, you learn very quickly how to deal with CEOs.
Yep.
And actually that was probably one of the best experiences I could have had, because as I went through the Carl Bayer career, that for my first 12 years, they were later bought by Hill and Knowlton, which is more of a household name than Carl Bayer. They had me on assignments. I was 5 years in San Francisco. I was 5 years in Washington, D.C., running the combined offices of Carl Bayer and Hill and Knowlton and Gray and Company. I was the deputy general manager there.
Okay.
And it was there that actually I supervised probably 8 or 10 different client teams, and one of the teams that I was asked to join was going out to Dallas to pitch American Airlines. And since I had Alaska Airlines as a client and had worked very briefly, for 18 months or so as the head of communications for Alaska Airlines, I was like the only guy on the team who had airline experience. So, we went to Dallas, we met with Crandall and the executive team, and within about 30 minutes, they called us back in and said, can you start now? And literally I had packed for an overnight trip. And
Yep.
5 days later, I saw my condo in DC again. It was,
Very cool.
Anybody who knows or has heard of Crandall's style knows that he's a demanding, right now sort of guy. And so thanks to the overnight cleaning service at the Hyatt and a local Dillard's, I was able to get through the week with packing for an
Cleaned
overnight.
and dressed. Yep.
So I spent the next 3 or 4 years as a consultant, going back and forth between Dallas and Washington, seeing a lot more of Dallas than I saw of Washington during those years. And finally, in 1992, Bob asked me to come in to head up the corporate communications function, which at the time, American was the world's second largest airline, and it ultimately, after we merged with a couple of other carriers, including TWA, and that's a sad story, but
It is.
we were the world's largest airline, and it was you learn a whole lot running communications for an airline that's in the news literally
Every day.
several times a day.
I can only imagine.
Every screw up that happens, every passenger we disappoint, we'll hear about it
Scrutinized. Yep.
on the Tonight Show, in the monologue, or our flight attendant spilled hot coffee on Ellen Burstyn, and she was to appear on the Tonight Show that night, and we got an earful. And it was it was quite an experience, but it was sort of the best of times and the worst of times there.
Right. I can imagine. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So I mentioned in the intro to the show, and we talked a little bit, offline before we got started here, but I know that, again, being in that role before, during, and after 9/11, which I'm sure I would imagine just coincidental timing of us recording this when we're recording it, right? We just had the, 20 years has just passed. And I know there was a lot of people doing a lot of reflection around that. And I'm sure that you were very much one of them, but I'd love for you to just kind of guide that conversation the way that you would, just of what that was like in that role before, during, and after.
Well, it was, at the time I joined the airline, in fact, the reason we were hired to come in as a consultant is in the late 80s and early 90s, the airline was was posting record profitability. I mean, it was just, it was amazing that an airline was making money, you know. And so Crandall wanted to celebrate that. So we created we call it the celebration of record performance, and staged a big event for all of our managers and employees, so that they could celebrate winning for a change. And from that, you know, things were relatively normal for maybe a year. And then we went through the infamous flight attendant Thanksgiving strike. And as everyone knows, Thanksgiving is the busiest travel time of the year. And so dealing with the flight attendant strike was character building. I'll just put it
modest way to put it. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah. I was on my way with Bob. We were flying up to Chicago for him to give a speech, and the co-pilot came out of the cockpit and grabbed us. We were both sitting in first class, and he said, "We need to talk up in the galley." So we went up to the galley, and he said, "We just lost an Eagle aircraft on approach to Chicago." And so we landed in Chicago. Bob went down the back stairs. I went out to the horde of reporters that were waiting, and we staged, you know, a news conference and offered our condolences and all of that. But it was the first crash American had had since the 80s, the 70s, late 70s, when it lost a jumbo jet on takeoff from Chicago. So after that point, we had another Eagle loss just outside of Raleigh-Durham. That there were some survivors in that crash. The pilot was able to land in some trees, and that buffered the crash a little bit. We lost a plane on like 2 days before Christmas that was going from Miami to Cali, to Cali, Colombia. And there were no survivors of that crash. The plane, the pilots put in the wrong coordinates, and instead of flying through a valley, they flew into the side of a mountain. And the fascinating thing about that was the area that they crashed was rebel-held territory. So
I remember that.
Yeah, we had to send a team down, and I had one Spanish speaker on my team, and she had been with us like 3 weeks, and
wow.
Which was one of my many lessons was have multilingual people on your team whenever possible, because you're going to need them whether you think so or not. So, you know, we got through the Cali crash. We lost. We had a plane that sort of missed the runway in Little Rock, and there were a lot of survivors to that, but there were also a lot of casualties. So, you know, we had quite a bit of experience with our crisis manual, and in fact, after every one of those incidents, we would go and, you know, update the manual on things we've learned.
Debrief, exactly.
Yeah, and you know, we had to run 24/7 shifts, you know, so that people, you know, you had to force people to go home after 8 hours because they all wanted to stay and help, but you know, you needed fresh people, you know, every 8 hours. So when 9/11 happened, it was as I told my team from the crisis command center, you can put the crisis manual away, because nothing in it anticipates that your aircraft are going to be hijacked and used as armed missiles against the United States. So I, fortunately or unfortunately, I had spent the night of the 10th in a sleep clinic because my wife was tired of my snoring. And
sleep apnea. Okay. Exactly. On the 10th of, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So, and if you know anything about these sleep clinics, you don't sleep. I mean, they wire you up,
Kind of poked and prodded all through the night, right?
Yeah. So basically, I woke up, took a shower, and
Not well rested.
not real rested, and went to work. And I was running about 30 minutes later than I normally would. And I was maybe 3 miles from the American Airlines headquarters when my phone and my buzzer, or my beeper, went off at the same time. And that was weird because, it told me that somebody needed to reach me.
Right.
And so I immediately called into the office, and they said, we've lost contact with an aircraft that we think has been hijacked. And I said, well, I'm on my way directly to the command center. Why don't you group the team and we'll talk when I get there. So they were over in the headquarters office. I went to the Strategic Operations Center. And by the time I got there, we realized that the first plane into the World Trade Center was ours. We also realized that we had lost contact with 2 or 3 other planes. Some of them were just mistakes that, a couple of them had accidentally turned off their transponders.
Sure.
But one of them had been hijacked and went directly into the Pentagon. And, these were full wide body flights doing a transcon. So they're full of fuel, which is highly explosive. And, it was a fascinating time. Our president, the airline president, Gerard Arpey at the time, after we watched the United flight, we had these huge, big projection screens in the Strategic Command Center. And after we watched the United flight hit the second
Tower,
we heard Arpey bark out, "Deck the fleet." And that was his shorthand for put every plane on the ground wherever it is as soon as it can land. And we did that, and then got on the phone with the Secretary of Transportation, the head of the FAA, and ultimately Dick Cheney joined us. They were all in the bunker together. And we told them that we had just grounded our fleet, and within minutes, the FAA ordered the entire West Airline fleet to be grounded, and for all the international flights coming in to not enter the United States. So, we had to find places in Canada where they could land, and
sure,
it was a fascinating time. The other complication was we got a call from the FBI saying we're sending a team of agents over because we're treating this not as an aircraft incident, but as a criminal offense. And we don't want anyone from your team or from United Airlines talking to the media. Well, that didn't dampen the media's interest in the story. So, of course, we tore down the normal press conference set that we had for these events at the headquarters. That's when I called them and said, put the manual away because we're not going to be bound by it. And fortunately, even though we couldn't make any press statements, we had set up a telephone hotline for our CEO, Don Carty, who could get on the hotline once a week and give updates on the airline and object to any things that the unions might be saying about us that we found off base. So it was a good vehicle for him to communicate with our employees, and then the same message went out on our printers that are in all the stations as a thing called Jetwire. So we had that at our disposal, and I talked to Don and I said, we can't talk to the media, but we have an obligation to talk to our employees. And if we use your hotline, since the media has the phone number, we can be communicating messages of encouragement and condolences and you know, the stuff you need to be saying during that kind of crisis via your hotline. And he bought into the idea right away and said, you know, if the FBI arrests you, I don't have any knowledge of what you made me do.
Sure.
So the FBI actually never caught on. So we continued this for literally for months, because after 9/11, it was incredibly difficult to get people in the air again. First of all, it took a week to get planes back in the air, period. Right. And they were all out of place. You know, they weren't where they were intended to be. And you know, as the airline went deeper and deeper into financial crisis, that hotline became a really critical way for us to communicate with our employees the dire straits we were in.
Sure.
You know, finally we got, you know, the business travelers back, and you know, some of the leisure travelers back, but not enough to erase, you know, the huge losses. On the day before 9/11, American Airlines had $16 billion in unencumbered assets.
Okay.
And within 6 weeks after, we had $16 billion in debt. So that just shows you the swing.
$32 billion swing in 6 weeks, effectively.
Exactly. Yeah. Wow. So, and those were real dollars back then. I mean, people throw billions around now, like, you know, it's cancer, but
sure.
This was the real deal. And
oh my gosh.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we, you know, 9/11 obviously happened in September. In November, we lost an A300 plane that was departing JFK for the Dominican Republic. And it crash landed after takeoff in Rockaway Beach in Long Island. So we had that issue to deal with. And Don and I immediately got on a plane and flew up to JFK, and we met with then Mayor Giuliani and Governor Pataki and the newly elected but not yet sworn in Mayor Bloomberg, and we did a press briefing, and then I did, you know, some additional press briefings, and Don went to console some of the family members who were there, and you know, unfortunately the plane was full, and it was a complete loss of life. So and then if that wasn't enough, on the weekend before Christmas, I decided it was time for my group to just sort of unwind a little bit. So I had a big Christmas party at my house for the whole team.
Yep. And
we were in the middle of the Christmas party. We were wondering where our head of news was, a guy named Al Becker, who was often quoted, you know, in American stories. And Al calls me and said, we've just had an incident, and we've got a plane on the ground in Boston that was diverted because they found a shoe bomber trying to light a bomb with his shoe.
Remember that? Yep.
And so, you know, the party ended rather abruptly, and you know, we all gathered back in the office to deal with the shoe bomber. And the Boston Airport Authority felt like they had to be out, you know, in front. So they put out a lot more information about this incident than we were particularly interested in having out there. And so it was sort of the nightmare that you didn't wake up from September 11 to Christmas. I had planned to take the week of Christmas off and just go to the Eastern Shore of Maryland with my wife and stay in a friend's house on the beach and just unwind. And about the time that we unpacked, I got a call from sort of my number two on the staff, and he said, well, we've had another problem. And I said, please don't tell me it's a plane. And he said, no, this time our pilot refused to allow Secret Service agent on board because he wouldn't surrender his weapon. And it turned out the Secret Service agent was on his way to Crawford, Texas to guard President Bush. So, we yet made another couple of news cycles with that faux pas. I mean, the captain is in control of the ship, so
Yep.
It's his call to make. And in my view, he made the wrong call.
Sure.
That's just because it's created more work for me.
Yeah, well, that's a valid, your incentive there. Yeah. Wow. Well, so let me ask you this, just in the, because again, I could talk to you about this all day. 20 years later, looking back on that time period, what do you remember? Well, obviously I'm sure there's a lot that you remember, but what just, just reflecting on that, how do you feel 20 years later?
Well, I didn't feel anything for a while, and that was bothersome because I wasn't.
I bet.
I had to sort of contain my emotions, and finally, I realized that several fellow executives from the airline were seeing a therapist who was sort of helping them work through it.
Cope.
And once I spent some time with her, I was able to process what had happened and grieve, because it was a time of real grief.
Grieving.
But when you're tied up in it, you don't have time for grief. So 20 years later, well, every year for the last 20 years,
sure.
when September 11 rolls around on the calendar, I just have this this gut wrenching feeling of loss, and it's rather quickly followed by a feeling of accomplishment, because what we did after 9/11 and during 9/11, and the way we were able to sidestep the FBI's commands on not speaking to the press
and press on.
We were able to get our messages out, and that was really my job, to make sure that that all of our stakeholders, our shareholders, our customers, our employees, federal oversight officials knew what we were doing and what we were thinking, and so I have two feelings, really. It's first that deep sense of loss, and mixed with a little shock, because it's still, when I see the videos now,
yeah, I know,
it's just I'm thinking I can't fathom that that happened, but I was in the room when it happened, so I know it did.
I know.
But now it's still a sense of loss, but it's tempered somewhat by the fact that we made it through, and that gives me some relief. I don't wallow in the grief part, because there's really sort of no point in doing that.
Yeah, there's no coming. Yeah, I agree. There was really not any coming back from that. I think, Tim, I again appreciate you sharing that story and sharing your story. I mean, you to think that the young man that made the decision on a whim to go to school at CMSU and ultimately graduate, and there's some world traveling along the way, a whole lot of heady stuff, like you said, that you had early on in your career, that in some ways maybe culminated around everything that happened with 9/11 and being there and seeing it through. I can imagine that you've had to develop a pretty incredible sense of resiliency and just discipline and hard work to get through all that and to press on. And I admire that. So I appreciate you sharing that story.
No, I appreciate that. I know your time is probably running short here, but I stayed with the airline until
please,
early 2003, when I found myself spending more time with bankruptcy counsel from New York than spending time, doing my actual job. And I put some feelers out after I got that PR award, and I got a pretty receptive response, and several different offers. And when I had one particular offer that I didn't accept. Well, I did accept it, and then I withdrew it because I went up to talk to Don Carty, our CEO, and I said, I'm leaving. I'm going to ABC. It was to run corporate communications for ABC Network, and he said, well, if you were one of the younger guys, which I still tease him about because I was only maybe 45 or
yeah, right, yeah, not old.
He said, if you're one of the younger guys, I'd suggest you just hang in here because we'll make it through all this and bankruptcy will be fine. And I said, well, I made a decision to leave. And he said, well, if you made the decision, I'm on the board of Dell, and I know they've been looking for a VP for corporate communications, and let me give Michael a quick call. And I went back to my office, and the phone rang as soon as I sat down. It was Don saying that he talked to Michael, and they understood that it was going to have to be speed dating because the whole packet from HR at ABC and Disney was sitting on my desk.
Mm-hmm.
And
yep.
I said, they're going to need to make a decision about me in 3 or 4 days. Because otherwise I'm headed to Burbank. And obviously with Dell being in Round Rock or Austin, it made it a lot more family friendly for me to stay in Texas. And my daughters were living with my ex-wife, their mother, but they boarded Southwest every Friday afternoon, and we sent them back every Sunday afternoon, and they were with us every summer and all those school breaks. So, they could have done that in Burbank, but it would have just been a little bit more of a hassle because of the fewer flights and longer trip. So I ended up at Dell and got a call one day to join a spinoff of Motorola. They were spinning off their $5 billion semiconductor division. They wanted to do an IPO. And in the tech space, there weren't a lot of IPOs happening at the time. And because Motorola was going to continue to be a big customer of this new entity, they had to hire a whole new executive team. And they'd hired a Frenchman from IBM to be the CEO. And they asked who he wanted the next hire to be. And he said, I need a head of marketing and communications, because we're not going to attract really good people until we can raise our profile and let people know who this new entity is, this 50-year-old new company that we're forming called Freescale. So we did our IPO. I joined them. We did our IPO. It was a huge success. The company outperformed analyst expectations every quarter. We had operations all over the world. So I was literally traveling probably 70% of the time to Asia and Europe and China.
Very cool.
It was an interesting experience. And 2 years after our IPO, Blackstone, Carlyle, and TPG combined for 16. Well, if you count debt, a $19 billion
takeover, basically, take it private.
Taking it private, yeah. So I've had a lot of M&A experience, fortunately, as we bought and sold Airlines, at American, and spun off various divisions. So when you're an executive of a company that's being taken private, and all of your benefits vest at the day of closing, it's a very happy day.
Of course.
So
Good for
stayed
you.
for a couple of months, and then realized that it was time for me to leave the corporate world. So we moved.
This was what year?
Pardon?
What year was this?
This was 07.
Okay.
So I was there from 04 to 07, and no one expected the buyout. That was
Sure. That's fantastic though.
Happy surprise. So we moved back to Dallas, and I spent the next 12 years doing nonprofit stuff. I figured that all the tools that we used on the corporate side would be just as applicable in a nonprofit setting. So I worked for two large academic medical centers, UT Southwestern here in Dallas and UNTL Science Center in Fort Worth. And sure enough, I mean, the things that we felt were kind of routine in marketing and advertising and communications in the corporate world were like marvels in the nonprofit sector, because they don't typically attract people that have strong corporate backgrounds. So
sure.
And in 2015 or 16, I think, I woke up one morning and thought, okay, I've been doing this for 43 years. I don't need to continue working. I gave them 3 months notice till the end of their fiscal year, and just essentially retired. I've done a lot of consulting in the years since I, quote unquote, retired, but I've just sort of begun I enjoyed traveling a whole lot until COVID came along.
Right.
Especially with a daughter living in London. It's been a fascinating time. And it's been a fascinating life. And in many respects, I think it started when I walked on that campus on an August afternoon. It was July. It was a July afternoon. And I remember driving by the Citizens Bank time and temperature thing, and it was 100 degrees, when I drove into Warrensburg. But I wouldn't have changed that decision for anything. And that same impulsiveness, has sort of carried through.
Yeah, it's had to.
My career,
And it would have had to have.
Yeah, well, you have to do things on instinct when you're in this business. Yep. And you either trust your instincts or you don't. And 99% of the time I trust mine. So
Tim, that's you obviously don't need this encouragement from me, I am sure, but you should write a book. I know you're hearing it from a lot of people, but I've
had a few people.
You should do it.
Because during the agency years, it was, I had some phenomenal experiences. I spent 3 days traveling with Richard Harris. HBO was a client of ours, and they had taped him on Broadway doing Camelot 40 years after he had done it the first time. And so we traveled together for 3 days, and that was an absolute indescribable blast, because the guy is wild and crazy.
Yeah.
And that could take 2 chapters of the book.
Yep.
Got to spend 3 or 4 days traveling with Gene Kelly, the dancer. HBO was introducing Cinemax, and it was originally contemplated for old movies, and so Gene was going around to various cities, promoting the Cinemax brand. They later changed their focus, but he was a hoot. And he was dating Tony Bennett's wife at the time, which was
really
made it even more fascinating, because they weren't divorced yet.
Yeah, I bet.
And she left her purse or her wallet in the limo. And when I got back in, I saw it. And so I went right back into the airport and called PSA and said, catch Gene Kelly when he deboards, and let his companion know I have her wallet. So, which included her address book and lots of personal information that I probably shouldn't have looked at, but I did. So, anyway, but there were so many phenomenal experiences, both on the agency and the corporate side, that this is a life that I wouldn't trade for any, frankly.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible, Tim. And again, I can't thank you enough for taking, your valuable time to come on here today and talk to our audience about your story. And again, I love that. Well, it doesn't start, but I do love that it starts with, in some ways, the impulsive decision on that July day in the Midwest to go drive to Warrensburg. And, we fast forward all these years later and, look, it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I'm sorry I'll miss homecoming this year because I'll be in Scotland for my daughter's wedding that same weekend. So it's, but I try to make it up, every 4 or 5 years if I can.
Yeah.
But no, it did start at UCM. I mean, well, no, it started with the way I was brought up,
Yep.
And having good parents and grandparents, and that was the foundation, component of my being. So, well, listen, Cory, I appreciate your interest.
Thank you, Tim.
Talking about this because it's
very much so. Yeah, I wish that time was not an issue for us, or else we would continue talking. But again, I very much appreciate you being here. For those of you that are watching and listening at home, first, a quick shameless plug to please make sure that you subscribe to the show, whether you are watching or listening. If anyone would like to get a hold of me, of course, I am on social media on Facebook and LinkedIn. You can just search my name. I'm on Twitter. My handle is @CoryBittnerKC. Tim, if somebody wanted to connect or follow you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Probably on Twitter. Well, depending on their political views. Because
sure, fair enough. Well, and they can make that decision then.
I'm going to offend a lot of people if they're sensitive about the current political climate we're living in. But I'm @TDokester, TDOKESTER. I try to contain my rants on LinkedIn, but obviously I'm on LinkedIn as well, and would be happy to connect with anybody who's interested. And
perfect.
If anybody wants to light a fire under me about that book, they can feel free to do so, because right now all that's waiting is the writing, I think.
Yep.
So,
just waiting for you to do the work. More work for you, Tim. But well, good. Well, again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you all at home for watching and listening, and we'll look forward to talking with you next time. Thank you, Tim.
Great. Thanks, Cory.